I swear, this feels like the Cold War just woke up again. Russia's calling out America for flexing its power in the Caribbean. At 8:45 local time, U.S. warships appeared in Caribbean waters, launching anti-drug operations that Moscow now calls excessive force. And here's where it gets intense. In early November, quiet Caribbean waters turned into a stage for something far bigger than a routine patrol. U.S. fighter jets sliced through humid skies. Warships lined up like a silent armada. Thousands of American troops were deployed, all under one official headline, anti-drug operation. But the numbers tell a grimmer story. 14 boats were targeted. 61 people are dead. Washington called it a necessary strike against traffickers. Yet to the rest of the world, it looked like an army hunting ghosts, with real blood on the water. The campaign spanned the Caribbean Sea to the Eastern Pacific, covering routes long known for cocaine smuggling. But for countries watching nearby, Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua, this didn't look like just drug control. It looked like dominance. Even in Latin America, reactions were mixed. Some officials quietly admitted the U.S. might be overstepping. Others feared speaking out, knowing how fast Washington can turn allies into targets. And while American headlines barely blinked, in Moscow, alarms went off. Russian analysts called it a display of military intimidation. News anchors ran segments comparing it to the 1980s, when U.S. forces often cruised close to Soviet allies to send a message. That message this time? Washington still owns the waters near Latin America. But just when everyone thought it was a quiet flex, Russia fired back. And not with missiles, but with words. Moscow didn't take long to fire back. Not with missiles, but with words that hit just as hard. Within hours of the U.S. naval deployment announcement, the Russian Foreign Ministry issued a sharp condemnation, calling the move a provocation near sovereign waters and a destabilizing act that threatens peace in the Caribbean region. Officials warned Washington was again using anti-narcotics operations as a smokescreen for expanding its military footprint. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov told state media that Russia would not stand idly by if its allies were threatened, a clear message aimed at defending Venezuela. Russian diplomats in New York even hinted at raising the issue before the United Nations Security Council, accusing the U.S. of violating international norms. State television channels in Moscow framed the U.S. deployment as part of a larger Western strategy to encircle and pressure countries that reject American influence. In short, Russia's response wasn't just defensive. It was designed to rally domestic audiences and reassure allies that Moscow still has global reach, even thousands of miles from home. Here's the thing most people miss. The Caribbean isn't just a tropical paradise to Washington, it's a front line. These waters link the Gulf of Mexico, the Panama Canal, and key trade routes that feed into American ports. They're also corridors for massive drug trafficking operations from South America. That's why every few years the U.S. launches what it calls anti-narcotics missions. On paper, it's about intercepting smugglers. In reality, it's about presence, power projection, showing the world that the U.S. Navy still dominates the Western Hemisphere. Warships anchored off Venezuela's coast don't just fight drugs, they send a message. We're still here. Critics, though, aren't buying it. They argue these missions are more about politics than policing. Some Latin American experts even call them shadow operations, designed to keep governments like Venezuela's on edge. And with rising tensions worldwide, from the South China Sea to Eastern Europe, every U.S. move is watched under a microscope. Because when Washington sends ships into contested waters, it's never just about what it says it is. And here's where things start to heat up. Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro didn't waste a second pointing fingers. He's been saying it for years that the United States is trying to overthrow him, using sanctions, covert influence, and now naval intimidation. For Maduro, the sudden surge of U.S. warships off his coast wasn't about drugs. It was about power. He's long claimed Washington's goal is to destabilize his government, replace him with a pro-American leader, and seize control of Venezuela's massive oil reserves. That's why he's turned to Moscow, for protection, legitimacy, and leverage. Russia, in turn, has become Maduro's political lifeline. It helps Venezuela bypass Western sanctions, sell weapons, and back him on the international stage. Every time Washington tightens the noose, Moscow steps in with a handshake and another deal. So when American vessels appeared near Venezuelan waters, Caracas saw it as a direct threat to national sovereignty. The state media called it an act of provocation. And honestly, for a nation that's been cornered economically and politically, this was more than just military pressure. It was personal. Maduro responded the only way he could, by standing closer to Russia than ever before. This part shows just how deep the alliance goes. In May 2024, Vladimir Putin and Nicolas Maduro met in Moscow and signed what they called a strategic partnership agreement. On paper, it covered oil, defense, and trade. But in reality, it was a declaration of solidarity, a loud message to Washington that Russia isn't leaving the Western Hemisphere anytime soon. The deal strengthened their cooperation in energy exports, allowing Russian companies to work directly with Venezuela's state-owned oil giant PDVSA. It also deepened military ties, joint training programs, weapons sales, and the potential sharing of surveillance technology. For Russia, this wasn't charity, it was a strategy. Establishing influence just a few hundred miles from U.S. shores, a geopolitical mirror of what NATO does near Russia's borders. It was Moscow saying, if you can come near us, we can come near you. And for Venezuela, the partnership offered breathing room. Russian backing provided the legitimacy Maduro needed to face Western isolation. In every global forum, Moscow stood by him, blocking sanctions and defending Caracas from international condemnation. But hold on, from Washington's side, the story sounds very different. The U.S. government insists the Caribbean operation isn't about Venezuela or Russia at all. Officially, it's part of a broader campaign to disrupt drug trafficking routes that funnel billions of dollars worth of narcotics into North America. Pentagon and State Department briefings use phrases like ensuring regional stability and defending national security. According to their reports, drug cartels have been expanding operations across the Caribbean and Eastern Pacific. Some Caribbean nations have even voiced support, citing the devastating impact of the drug trade on their economies and youth. For them, American ships bring security, not politics, but not everyone buys that explanation. And here's where Moscow shifts from outrage to legal firepower. Russia argues that the U.S. military actions in the Caribbean outright violate international law. According to its foreign ministry, these operations cross the line defined by the United Nations Charter, which emphasizes respect for national sovereignty and non-interference. Moscow claims that unless such missions are explicitly approved by the UN Security Council or conducted with the host nation's consent, they breach global norms. Some legal experts agree the move could conflict with UN maritime conventions, particularly those regulating military activity within another country's exclusive economic zone. Instead of confrontation, Russia is now calling for restraint, dialogue, and collective security mechanisms. It wants a multilateral approach, meaning regional nations, not just Washington, should decide what happens in their waters. So while the U.S. frames it as law enforcement, Moscow frames it as law-breaking. And between those two versions, the Caribbean suddenly feels less like an ocean and more like a courtroom. But here's the bigger story. This isn't just about Venezuela or drug routes. It's about the U.S.-Russia rivalry spilling into new territory. For decades, these two powers have circled each other like boxers who never left the ring. The Cold War might have ended on paper, but its playbook clearly didn't. Russia's supporting socialist or anti-U.S. regimes, America's flexing its military muscle to remind the world who's still dominant. In the 20th century, that battlefront was Europe. In the 21st century, it's quietly shifted to Latin America, a region Washington once considered its uncontested sphere of influence. Now, Russia's presence in Venezuela and Cuba, combined with growing trade links with Nicaragua and Bolivia, looks like an attempt to chip away at that dominance. And it's not just Russia. China has been building ports, investing in infrastructure, and buying influence across the Caribbean and South America. Beijing's soft power moves add a third layer to this standoff, making it more crowded, more complex, and way more unpredictable. So when U.S. destroyers and Russian diplomats clash over these waters, it's not just about one mission. It's about who controls the narrative of power in the Western Hemisphere, and maybe even beyond. And here's the human side of the storm. Venezuela itself. The country has been in a deep economic crisis for years. Inflation has shattered savings, food shortages have become routine, and millions have fled searching for work abroad. Oil, once Venezuela's golden ticket, is now both its blessing and curse. It's the only major export keeping the lights on, yet it's also the main reason behind the sanctions crushing its economy. Those U.S. sanctions, aimed at pressuring Maduro's government, have instead pushed him straight into Moscow's arms. With Western banks off limits and foreign investors scared away, Russia became the lifeline, buying oil, investing in refineries, and shielding Caracas diplomatically. For the Kremlin, that dependency is leverage. Meanwhile, the U.S. naval presence near Venezuelan waters helps Maduro rally his base. He paints every American ship on the horizon as proof that Venezuela is under siege. It's propaganda that works because when your people are struggling, an external enemy can unite them faster than any reform. And here's the ripple effect. Many countries in the Caribbean and Latin America watch this game with their jaws on the floor. Some island states, battered by drug violence, publicly welcomed stronger U.S. action, saying anything that breaks cartel routes helps their streets and courts. Regional blocs also weighed in. CARICOM and several Central and South American diplomatic channels urged calm and called for diplomatic solutions, warning that heavy naval posturing risks miscalculation. Smaller nations worry they'll be forced to pick a side between two giants, which is never an easy choice. At the same time, Mexico and other neighbors have protested hard when strikes or operations stray near their waters. Sovereignty matters, especially when civilian lives are at stake. The overarching fear is real. What started as an anti-drug campaign could turn the Caribbean into a fresh flashpoint for great power competition. And that would make life in the region far less predictable. This is where the pundits and press sharpen their pencils. International analysts quickly labeled the region a proxy tension zone, arguing the moves are as much about signaling as they are about interdiction. The U.S., analysts say, is signaling it still intends to police the Western Hemisphere. Russia's vocal rebuttal is meant to show it still has friends and influence nearby. Media outlets from Reuters to AP to Al Jazeera rolled these threads together, reporting the U.S. strikes and buildup, Moscow's condemnation, and Caracas's alarm, while offering experts who warn neither side actually wants a shooting war. Some scholars stress this is classic geopolitical theater, a mix of legal arguments, political posturing, and limited military action meant to extract concessions or attention without triggering full-scale confrontation. Others caution that such moves lower the threshold for miscalculation. A patrol, a misidentified boat, or a communication lapse could turn rhetoric into real conflict. Now rewind the tape a bit. It's impossible not to hear Cold War echoes in all this. Think of the Cuban Missile Crisis and decades of U.S. interventions across Latin America. Coups, embargoes, and covert ops that left deep scars. Russia's modern support for Maduro and other anti-West governments looks eerily similar to Soviet-era patronage, backing allies to challenge U.S. influence. Meanwhile, U.S. naval presence near Venezuela recalls times when Washington publicly flexed to defend perceived hemispheric interests. History matters because memories of past interventions shape how governments, militaries, and publics react. Nations that lived through earlier decades of meddling are quicker to see patterns and louder to condemn them. So this isn't just geopolitics on paper. It's decades of distrust being replayed on modern waves. That context helps explain why protests in parliaments, and fiery state TV segments show up so quickly after a new naval move. Here's the cliff, and yeah, it could get messy. Expect more diplomatic sparring, public condemnations, emergency meetings at regional forums, and likely pushes for UN debates. Washington will argue legal authority to counter cartels. Moscow will press the sovereignty angle and rally regional partners. Sanctions or countermeasures aren't off the table if tensions rise. But many experts believe both sides prefer political leverage over hot war, so we might see an increase in military posturing, surveillance, and proxy diplomacy rather than direct conflict. Still, the risk is clear. The Caribbean could become a geopolitical fault line, a place where messaging, missteps, and regional grievances collide. What would you bet on? Escalation or uneasy detente? As tension brews across warm Caribbean waters, every move now feels like a signal, not just a strategy. What began as an anti-drug mission has turned into another front in the long shadow of US-Russia rivalry, proving that even distant waves can carry echoes of global power struggles. So, what's your take? Drop it in the comments, and if this hooked you, hit like and subscribe. More deep dives coming your way.